community theater in the small coastal town of Brookhaven had seen better days. Its red velvet seats were faded and worn in places. The carpet in the aisles showed paths where thousands of feet had walked over the decades, and the stage curtains had acquired a slightly musty smell that no amount of cleaning could completely eliminate. But for the people who lived in this tight-knit community of barely 8,000 residents, the theater was a treasured landmark, a place where generations had gathered for school plays, local talent shows, holiday concerts, and the occasional touring performance that made its way to their corner of the coast. On this particular Friday evening in late October, the theater was hosting its annual Community Talent Showcase, an event that had become a beloved tradition over the past 15 years. The showcase was organized by the local Arts Council as a fundraiser for youth programs, and it featured a mix of planned performances and spontaneous participation from audience members. Anyone could sign up in advance to perform, but the evening also included segments where the host would invite volunteers from the audience to come up and share whatever talent they possessed. These impromptu moments were often the most memorable parts of the show, producing everything from surprisingly good amateur singers to hilariously bad magic tricks that had the whole audience laughing. The theater was nearly full that evening, with families occupying most of the seats and the atmosphere buzzing with the friendly energy of neighbors gathering for a shared experience. Children fidgeted in their seats while their parents chatted across the aisles, catching up on local news and gossip. Teenagers clustered in small groups toward the back, some genuinely interested in the performances and others mainly there because their friends were performing or because it was one of the few entertainment options available in a town too small to have a movie theater or bowling alley. Among the audience members was a woman named Elena Martinez, who had moved to Brookhaven just 3 months earlier. She sat alone near the middle of the theater, her posture slightly reserved, her hands folded in her lap. Elena was in her early 40s, with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, and a face that carried the kind of quiet sadness that comes from recent loss and difficult transitions. She had moved to Brookhaven after her husband's death from cancer, leaving behind the city where they had built their life together because everything there reminded her too painfully of what she had lost. Brookhaven had been chosen almost randomly from a list of small coastal towns where she might afford to rent a modest apartment on her limited savings. She had no connections here, no family or friends, no history to anchor her. That anonymity had seemed appealing when she was making the decision to relocate, a chance to start over somewhere that held no memories of the life that had been taken from her. But the reality of living in a place where she knew no one had proven lonelier than she had anticipated. The past 3 months had been a blur of unpacking boxes, finding work as a part-time bookkeeper for several local businesses, and trying to figure out how to construct a new life from the ruins of her old one. Elena had come to the talent showcase on impulse, drawn by a flyer she had seen at the grocery store. She had no intention of participating, but the idea of being around other people, of sitting in a room full of life and energy and community, had appealed to her after too many evenings spent alone in her small apartment. She had hoped that attending a local event might help her begin to feel like she belonged here, might provide some sense of connection to this place that still felt foreign and temporary. The show had been underway for about 45 minutes when Elena arrived, slipping into her seat as quietly as possible to avoid drawing attention. On stage, a group of middle school students was finishing a somewhat chaotic but enthusiastic dance routine to a popular song. The audience applauded warmly when they finished, the kind of generous response that small communities give to young people trying their best. The host, a middle-aged man named Robert Chen who owned the local hardware store and had been emceeing the talent showcase for years, bounded back onto the stage with practiced energy. Robert had a natural gift for working a crowd, keeping the energy high while also being genuinely kind to the performers, especially the younger or more nervous ones. He thanked the dance group and then announced that it was time for another audience participation segment. He explained that he was looking for 3 volunteers who would be willing to come up and perform something, anything at all, for the audience. It could be singing, dancing, telling jokes, doing impressions, whatever they felt comfortable sharing. The only requirement was that they had to be willing to step out of their comfort zone and give it a try. Hands shot up around the theater, mostly belonging to children eager for their moment in the spotlight. Robert scanned the audience with an experienced eye, looking for a mix of ages and types that would keep the segment interesting. He selected a young boy of about 10 who wanted to show off his basketball tricks, a teenage girl who promised to do impressions of famous singers, and then his eyes landed on Elena, sitting quietly in the middle section with no hand raised and a slightly startled expression as she realized he was looking directly at her. Robert's instinct told him that this woman, sitting alone and looking somewhat out of place, might benefit from being included in the community fun. He had seen that look before on people who were new to town or going through difficult times, a kind of isolation that showed in the way they held themselves apart from the easy camaraderie around them. His invitation was meant as a kindness, a gentle way of welcoming her into the fold. He pointed at Alina and said in his cheerful host voice that she looked like someone who might have a hidden talent to share, and wouldn't she come up and be their third volunteer? Alina felt panic flood through her body as hundreds of faces turned to look at her. She shook her head quickly, waving her hands in a gesture that clearly meant no thank you, absolutely not. But the audience, warmed up by the earlier performances and in the mood for good-natured encouragement, began to clap and cheer, urging her to participate. Robert, misreading her reluctance as simple shyness rather than genuine distress, continued his friendly cajoling, assuring her that it was all in good fun and that everyone was supportive and kind. The pressure of all those eyes and voices focused on her made it increasingly difficult to refuse, without seeming rude or creating an awkward moment that would draw even more attention. With a feeling of resignation mixed with something close to desperation, Alina stood up. Her legs felt unsteady as she made her way down the aisle toward the stage, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She had not sung in public for more than 2 years, not since before her husband's diagnosis had turned their lives upside down and consumed all their energy and attention. Music had been such an integral part of her identity for most of her life, but it had become impossible to access during the long months of hospitals and treatments and the crushing weight of watching someone you love slowly dying. Alina climbed the steps to the stage and stood with the other 2 volunteers, the young boy bouncing with excitement beside her and the teenage girl checking her hair and practicing her performance face. Robert welcomed all 3 of them warmly and then asked each what they planned to do. The boy demonstrated a few basketball moves he had been practicing, dribbling an imaginary ball and pretending to shoot. The audience clapped appreciatively. The teenage girl announced that she would sing a few lines from songs by different famous artists, and the audience had to guess who she was imitating. More applause and laughter. Then Robert turned to Alina and asked what she would like to share with everyone. Alina's mind went blank for a moment, overwhelmed by the situation she found herself in. She could feel the weight of expectation from the audience, all these strangers waiting to see what she would do. In that moment of panic, something shifted inside her. Perhaps it was the realization that she had nothing to lose, that these people did not know her and would never need to see her again if she embarrassed herself. Perhaps it was exhaustion with the grief that had been holding her hostage for so long. A sudden fierce desire to reclaim something of who she had been before loss had redefined her entire existence. She heard herself say, in a voice that sounded steadier than she felt, that she would sing. Robert's face lit up with pleasure, and he asked if she needed any musical accompaniment. Alina shook her head, saying she would sing without accompaniment, a cappella. Robert nodded approvingly and announced to the audience that they were in for a special treat, that singing without instruments was one of the most challenging and pure forms of musical performance. He gestured for her to step forward to the microphone that stood at center stage. Alina walked to the microphone on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. She stood before it, looking out at the sea of faces barely visible beyond the stage lights. The theater had fallen quiet, the kind of attentive silence that audiences give to performers before they begin. In that silence, Alina felt the full weight of what she was about to do. She had not chosen a song in advance, had not prepared or warmed up or done any of the things a sensible person would do before attempting to sing in public. She was operating purely on instinct and impulse, drawing on decades of training and experience that felt both distant and immediate. She closed her eyes for a moment, reaching inside herself for the music that had been silent for so long. And then, without announcement or preamble, she began to sing. The song that emerged from her was O mio babbino caro, a famous aria from Puccini's opera Gianni Schicchi. It was a piece she had performed many times in her previous life, back when she had been a professional opera singer with a developing career and a future that seemed full of possibility. The aria told the story of a young woman pleading with her father to allow her to marry the man she loves, threatening to throw herself into the river if he refuses. The emotion in the piece was raw and desperate, a perfect vehicle for everything Alina had been holding inside for the past 2 years. Her first note cut through the silence of the theater like a beam of light breaking through clouds. It was pure and powerful, carrying a richness and depth that seemed impossible to be coming from this ordinary-looking woman standing alone on the community theater stage. The sound filled every corner of the space, reaching into the highest balcony and the furthest back row with crystalline clarity. In that single note, everything about Alina was transformed. She was no longer a lonely newcomer sitting anonymously in the audience. She was an artist, a vessel for something transcendent and deeply human. The audience's reaction was immediate and visceral. People who had been shifting in their seats or whispering to their neighbors froze into absolute stillness. Parents stopped wrestling with restless children. Teenagers looked up from their phones. Even the volunteers waiting at the side of the stage, who moments ago had been focused on their own performances, turned to stare at Alina with expressions of shock and awe. Alina continued to sing, her eyes still closed, her entire being focused on the music pouring out of her. The Italian lyrics flowed with perfect diction and emotional authenticity, each phrase shaped with the kind of artistry that comes from years of dedicated training and natural gift working in harmony. Her voice soared through the dramatic high notes with ease, sustained long phrases without any audible strain, and colored the words with subtle variations in tone that conveyed the character's desperation and love. But what made her performance truly extraordinary was not just the technical excellence, though that was undeniable. It was the emotion behind the singing, the sense that she was not merely performing a piece of music, but channeling genuine feeling through it. Every note carried the weight of her grief, her loneliness, her struggle to find meaning in a life that had been shattered by loss. The aria's themes of love and desperation resonated with her own experience in ways that made the performance intensely personal and vulnerable. As Alina sang, tears began to stream down her face, though her voice never wavered or broke. The tears were not a distraction from the performance but an integral part of it, a visible manifestation of the emotion that infused every note. She was not crying in a way that felt performative or manipulative, but rather as if the act of singing had broken through the careful control she had been maintaining for months and released feelings that could no longer be contained. The audience watched in stunned silence, many of them experiencing something they would remember for the rest of their lives. In that small-town community theater, during what was supposed to be a lighthearted talent showcase, they were witnessing art at its most powerful and authentic. They were seeing a human being stripped of pretense and protection, offering herself completely through music. It did not matter that most of them knew nothing about opera or classical singing technique. They could feel the truth and beauty of what Alina was creating, and it moved them profoundly. When Alina reached the final phrase of the aria, she opened her eyes for the first time since beginning to sing. She looked out at the audience as she sang the last words, a plea for understanding and compassion. Her voice rose to the final high note and held it with perfect control before letting it fade gradually into silence. Then she stood still, her chest rising and falling with deep breaths, tears still wet on her cheeks, completely exposed and vulnerable before a room full of strangers. For a long moment after she finished, there was absolute silence in the theater. It was not an awkward silence but rather a stunned one, as if the audience needed time to process what they had just experienced. Alina stood at the microphone, suddenly aware of where she was and what she had just done, feeling a mixture of exhilaration and fear about how her performance would be received. Then the silence broke and the theater erupted into applause. But this was not the polite, encouraging applause that had greeted the earlier performers. This was thunderous, overwhelming, the kind of response usually reserved for professional concerts in major venues. People leaped to their feet, giving Alina a standing ovation that shook the old building. Some audience members were crying openly, moved beyond words by what they had just witnessed. Others were cheering and whistling, their faces showing amazement and joy. Alina stood on the stage, completely overwhelmed by the response. She had expected polite appreciation at best, awkward sympathy at worst. She had not expected this, had not imagined that her impromptu performance in a small-town talent showcase would create such an impact. The applause continued for what felt like an eternity, wave after wave of sound washing over her. Robert Chen, the host, stood at the side of the stage with tears in his own eyes, making no move to interrupt the audience's response or move the show along to the next segment. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. The standing ovation continued for nearly 3 minutes, an extraordinary length of time that left Alina feeling disoriented and emotionally exposed. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, trying to compose herself, but the tears kept coming. They were no longer just tears of grief but something more complex, a release of pressure that had been building inside her for months. The audience's response was giving her permission to feel everything she had been suppressing, and the relief of that permission was almost as overwhelming as the grief itself. Robert Chen finally walked back to center stage, his own composure somewhat shaken by what had just occurred. He approached Alina and gently took her hand, raising it in a gesture of celebration that prompted another surge of applause. When the noise finally began to subside enough for him to be heard, Robert spoke into his microphone with genuine emotion in his voice. He said that in 15 years of hosting this event, he had never witnessed anything like what they had just experienced. He asked Alina if she would be willing to tell the audience a little bit about herself, where she had trained, where she had performed before. Alina took a shaky breath and leaned toward the microphone. Her voice was rough with emotion as she explained that she had studied vocal performance at a conservatory in New York and had worked as a professional opera singer for nearly 15 years. She had performed with regional opera companies across the country, had sung in churches and concert halls, and had been building what she hoped would be a significant career. But life had taken unexpected turns, she said carefully, and she had not sung publicly in more than 2 years. Moving to Brookhaven 3 months ago had been part of starting over, trying to figure out who she was now and what her life could look like going forward. She did not mention her husband's death or the devastating grief that had silenced her voice. Those details felt too private to share with a room full of strangers, no matter how warmly they had responded to her singing. But the audience seemed to understand without needing explicit information that they had witnessed something significant, a moment of healing or transformation or rebirth. The applause that followed her brief explanation was warm and supportive, welcoming her to their community in a way that went far beyond polite acceptance of a newcomer. As Alina left the stage and returned to her seat, she felt people reaching out to touch her arm or shoulder as she passed, offering gestures of connection and appreciation. When she finally sat down, the woman sitting next to her, someone she had never met before, took her hand and squeezed it gently. The simple human contact, the first she had experienced in weeks beyond brief interactions with cashiers and clients, made Alina's eyes fill with tears again. The talent showcase continued with its remaining performances, but the energy in the room had shifted. What had been a pleasant community event had become something more meaningful, elevated by Alina's unexpected performance into an evening people would talk about for years. The other performers who followed her did their best, and the audience remained supportive and encouraging. But everyone understood that they had witnessed something extraordinary that would be difficult to match. After the show ended, Alina found herself surrounded by people wanting to talk with her. Some were fellow music lovers who wanted to discuss opera and ask questions about her training and career. Others simply wanted to express how moved they had been by her performance, describing in halting words how her singing had touched something deep inside them. Several people pressed business cards or phone numbers into her hand, insisting that she call them, that they would love to have coffee and get to know her better, that Brookhaven was lucky to have someone of her talent joining their community. Among the well-wishers was a woman named Patricia Hartwell, who introduced herself as the music director at the local Episcopal church. Patricia was in her 60s, with silver hair and an energetic manner that suggested someone who had spent a lifetime working in arts education. She told Alina that the church had a small but dedicated choir and occasionally hosted concerts featuring local and regional musicians. She would be honored, Patricia said, if Alina would consider singing at one of their Sunday services or perhaps giving a concert in the church sanctuary, which had excellent acoustics. Alina was taken aback by the invitation, unsure how to respond. Part of her wanted to retreat, to return to the safety of anonymity and solitude. But another part, awakened by the experience of performing again, felt drawn to the possibility of continuing to sing, of allowing music back into her life in a way that might be sustainable and healing. She took Patricia's card and promised to think about it, making no firm commitment but not closing the door entirely. Another person who approached Alina was a man named James Wu, a music teacher at the local high school. James was younger, probably in his early 30s, with an enthusiasm for music education that was immediately apparent. He explained that the high school had a vocal music program that was struggling due to budget cuts and declining enrollment. Most of his students had potential, but lacked exposure to professional-level singing and classical technique. He wondered if Alina might be willing to come speak to his classes sometime, perhaps give a demonstration, or even consider offering private voice lessons to students who were serious about pursuing music. The idea of teaching appealed to Alina in ways she had not anticipated. During her performing career, she had occasionally given master classes or worked with younger singers, and she had always found those experiences rewarding. Teaching might offer a way to stay connected to music without the pressure and vulnerability of public performance. It could provide both income and purpose, two things she desperately needed as she tried to rebuild her life. She told James that she was interested and would contact him to discuss possibilities. By the time Alina finally extracted herself from the conversations and made her way out of the theater, it was nearly midnight. She walked slowly back to her apartment through the quiet streets of Brookhaven, her mind spinning with everything that had happened. The evening had begun as a simple attempt to feel less alone, and it had transformed into something she could not have predicted. She She had exposed herself in ways she had not intended, but instead of the judgment or pity she had feared, she had received warmth and acceptance and genuine appreciation. When Alina reached her small apartment and closed the door behind her, she stood in the darkness for a long moment before turning on the lights. She felt exhausted but also strangely energized, as if something frozen inside her had begun to thaw. She walked to the window and looked out at the street below, at the small town that had witnessed her breaking open. For the first time since moving here, Brookhaven did not feel entirely foreign. It felt like a place where she might possibly belong, where she might be able to construct something new from the pieces of her shattered life. The morning after the talent showcase, Alina woke later than usual, her body heavy with the emotional exhaustion of the previous evening. For a few moments, she lay in bed wondering if the whole experience had been a dream, if she had really stood on that stage and sung in front of hundreds of people. But the business cards and phone numbers scattered across her nightstand confirmed that it had been real, as did the lingering soreness in her throat from singing without proper warm-up or preparation. She got up and made coffee, then sat at her small kitchen table looking at the cards people had pressed into her hands. Patricia Hartwell's card from the church, James Wu's from the high school, and several others from people who had introduced themselves so quickly that Alina could barely remember their names or faces. She felt overwhelmed by the sudden attention, by the expectations that seemed to have been placed on her in the space of a single evening. Part of her wanted to throw the cards away and pretend the whole thing had never happened, to return to the safe isolation she had been maintaining. But as Alina sat drinking her coffee and thinking about the experience of singing again, she realized that something fundamental had shifted. The act of performing had reconnected her with a part of herself she had thought was lost forever. Music had been central to her identity for most of her life, from childhood piano lessons through conservatory training to her professional career. When grief and trauma had silenced her voice, she had lost not just her ability to sing, but her sense of who she was at the most basic level. Last night, for those few minutes on stage, she had been herself again. Not the broken widow struggling to survive each day, but Alina Martinez, the artist, the musician, the person who could take abstract notation on a page and transform it into something that moved people to tears. The realization that this part of her still existed, that it had not been destroyed by loss and grief, felt like discovering that she could still breathe after nearly drowning. Alina's phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. She almost did not answer, expecting it to be a telemarketer or wrong number since almost no one had her new number. But curiosity made her pick up, and she heard Patricia Hartwell's warm voice on the other end. Patricia apologized for calling so early on a Saturday morning, but said she had not been able to stop thinking about Alina's performance. She wanted to reiterate her invitation for Alina to sing at the church, and she had a specific proposal in mind. The church was planning a special Thanksgiving service that would include music from various traditions and cultures, Patricia explained. It was still a month away, which would give Alina time to prepare if she was interested. The service attracted a large congregation, including many people from the wider community who did not regularly attend church, but came for the special music and the sense of communal celebration. Patricia thought Alina's voice would be perfect for the kind of sacred music they wanted to feature, and she would be happy to work with Alina to select repertoire that felt comfortable and meaningful. Alina listened to Patricia's enthusiastic description of the service and the music program, feeling both tempted and terrified by the invitation. The idea of singing again appealed to her, but the thought of taking on a commitment felt risky. What if her voice failed her? What if last night's performance had been a fluke, a one-time burst of capability that could not be repeated? What if preparing for a concert brought back all the pain and grief she had been trying to escape? All the pain and grief she had been trying to escape. But even as these fears rose up, Alina recognized them as the voice of trauma and loss trying to keep her safe by keeping her small. She had spent 2 years letting fear dictate her choices, and where had it gotten her? Alone in a strange town, going through the motions of living without really being alive, cut off from the thing that had always given her life meaning and purpose. Maybe it was time to make a different choice, to move toward something rather than away from everything. Alina told Patricia that she would like to sing at the Thanksgiving service, hearing the words come out of her mouth before she had consciously decided to say them. Patricia's delighted response confirmed that Alina had made the right decision, or at least a decision that felt right in this moment. They arranged to meet later in the week to discuss music selections and logistics, and when Alina hung up the phone, she felt a flutter of something that might have been anticipation, or might have been anxiety, or might have been both at once. Over the next few days, Alina found that her performance at the talent showcase had made her something of a local celebrity in Brookhaven. People recognized her at the grocery store and stopped to tell her how much they had enjoyed her singing. The woman who owned the coffee shop refused to let Alina pay for her latte, saying it was a small thank you for the beauty Alina had brought to the community. The pharmacist asked if there would be any recordings of her performance, because his mother-in-law had been at the showcase and had talked about nothing else since. The attention was both flattering and uncomfortable. Alina was not accustomed to being recognized in public, and the constant interactions with strangers exhausted her. But she also noticed that these encounters were changing her relationship with Brookhaven. The town no longer felt like a random place she had fled to in desperation. It was becoming somewhere she had a presence, where people knew her name and valued something she could offer. The anonymity she had thought she wanted was being replaced by connection, and while that felt vulnerable and sometimes overwhelming, it also felt like the beginning of belonging. James Wu, the high school music teacher, called her a few days after their conversation at the theater. He reiterated his interest in having Alina visit his classes and wondered if she might have time in the coming week. He was careful to emphasize that there would be no pressure, that she could simply talk about her training and career if she wanted, or she could demonstrate some technique, or she could just answer students' questions. Whatever felt comfortable for her would be wonderful, because his students rarely got to interact with professional musicians, and the exposure would be invaluable. Alina agreed to visit the school the following Thursday during James's 2 vocal music classes. She spent the intervening days thinking about what she might say to high school students about music and singing, and the often difficult path of pursuing art as a career. She remembered her own teenage years, the intensity of discovering her voice and realizing that singing was not just something she enjoyed, but something she needed to do, something that felt like the truest expression of who she was. She wondered if any of James's students felt that same calling, and if so, what wisdom she might offer them based on her own experiences. When Thursday arrived, Alina drove to Brookhaven High School with a mixture of nervousness and curiosity. The building was typical of small-town American high schools, a sprawling single-story structure built probably in the 1970s and showing its age. James met her in the main office and walked her to the music wing, chatting easily about his students and the challenges of maintaining an arts program in a district facing budget pressures. His passion for his work was evident, and Alina found herself warming to him as they walked. The first class consisted of about 20 students, mostly sophomores and juniors with a few freshmen. They looked at Alina with the kind of guarded interest teenagers bring to most adult interactions, curious but not wanting to appear too eager or impressed. James introduced Alina, providing a brief summary of her credentials that made her career sound more illustrious than it had felt while she was living it. Then he turned the floor over to her, and Alina found herself looking at 20 expectant faces waiting to see what she would do. She began by asking them questions rather than talking about herself. She wanted to know what kind of music they liked, what drew them to singing, whether any of them were considering music as a possible career. The questions opened up the conversation, and students began to share their interests and aspirations. One girl loved musical theater and dreamed of performing on Broadway someday. A boy with a surprisingly deep voice was interested in gospel music and sang in his church choir. Several students admitted they were taking the class because they needed an arts credit and had thought it would be easier than visual art. But a few of them had discovered they actually enjoyed singing more than they expected. Alina talked about her own path to becoming a professional singer, describing the years of training and the constant process of auditions and rejections that characterized a performing career. She was honest about the challenges, the financial instability, the emotional toll of putting yourself out there repeatedly and facing judgment. But she also talked about the moments of transcendence, the times when everything came together and she felt like she was channeling something larger than herself, connecting with audiences in ways that made all the difficulty worthwhile. Then James asked if Alina would be willing to demonstrate some vocal technique for the students, and Alina agreed. She led them through some basic warm-up exercises, explaining the importance of breath support and proper vocal placement. The students followed along, some self-consciously and others with genuine engagement. Alina could hear immediately which students had natural ability and which were struggling with basic pitch and tone production. She worked with a few individuals, making small adjustments to their posture or breathing that immediately improved their sound. One girl named Maya caught Alina's particular attention. She was a junior, quiet and somewhat withdrawn, but when she sang, her voice had a quality that suggested real potential. After the warm-up exercises, Alina asked Maya if she would be willing to sing something for the class. Maya looked terrified at the prospect but also pleased to have been singled out. She sang a contemporary pop song, and while her technique was rough and her confidence shaky, the raw material of a beautiful voice was clearly present. When Maya finished, Alina offered gentle feedback, praising the natural warmth of her tone while suggesting ways she could develop better breath control and expand her range. She asked Maya if she had ever considered private voice lessons, and the girl shook her head, explaining that her family could not afford them. The response struck Alina hard, reminding her of the economic barriers that prevented many talented young people from accessing the training they needed to develop their gifts. She made a mental note to talk with James later about possibilities for scholarship or reduced-cost instruction. The second class that day was smaller, only about 12 students, but several of them were more advanced singers who took their musical study seriously. Alina worked with them on more sophisticated concepts, discussing interpretation and emotional expression, the difference between technically correct singing and artistically meaningful performance. She talked about the vulnerability required to sing well, the necessity of connecting with the emotional truth of a piece even when that truth was uncomfortable or painful. Toward the end of the class, one student asked Alina if she would sing something for them. The request made her nervous, but she also felt that it would be unfair to ask them to be vulnerable if she was not willing to do the same. She asked James if there was a piano in the room, and he gestured to an upright in the corner. Alina sat down at the piano, took a moment to center herself, and then sang the Schubert song Ave Maria, accompanying herself on the piano. The classroom transformed as she sang, the casual atmosphere of a high school music class becoming something more serious and sacred. Alina poured everything into the performance, not holding back or protecting herself, allowing the students to see what it looked like when someone gave themselves completely to music. When she finished, the room was silent for a moment before the students erupted into applause. Several of them had tears in their eyes, moved by the raw beauty of what they had just witnessed. After the classes ended, James thanked Alina profusely for her time and her generosity with the students. He said that visits like this were invaluable, giving his students exposure to professional-level artistry that they could not get any other way. Then he asked if Alina would consider teaching private voice lessons, either at the school or independently. He had several students who were serious about singing and who needed more individual attention than he could provide within the constraints of his class schedule. Alina found herself agreeing before she had fully thought through the implications. Teaching would require her to be present and engaged, to show up consistently for students who would depend on her. It would pull her out of the isolation she had been living in and force her to structure her time around commitments to other people. But it would also provide income and purpose, and more importantly, it would keep her connected to music in a way that felt sustainable and meaningful. Over the following week, Alina met with Patricia at the church to discuss music for the Thanksgiving service. The church sanctuary was beautiful in its simplicity, with high ceilings and stained glass windows that filtered the afternoon light into pools of color. The acoustics were indeed excellent, and when Patricia had Alina sing a few phrases just to test the space, the sound bloomed and resonated in a way that made Alina's heart lift. They chose 3 pieces for Alina to perform during the service. One would be a classical sacred piece, Handel's I Know That My Redeemer Lived from Messiah. Another would be a traditional hymn arranged in a more contemporary style. The third would be a spiritual, There Is a Balm in Gilead, which Patricia thought would be particularly moving and appropriate for the themes of healing and hope they wanted to emphasize during the Thanksgiving service. As Alina began preparing for the church performance and setting up her teaching practice, she felt her life taking on a shape and structure it had lacked since her husband's death. She established a practice routine, working through vocal exercises and repertoire each morning in her apartment. She scheduled her first few voice students, starting with Maya from the high school and 2 other young singers James had recommended. She continued her bookkeeping work to maintain steady income while building her teaching practice gradually. The first voice lesson Alina taught was more emotional than she had anticipated. Maya arrived at Alina's apartment nervous and excited, clutching a folder of music she hoped to work on. Alina set her at ease with conversation and gentle warm-ups, then listened as Maya sang through several pieces. The girl's voice was even more promising than Alina had initially thought, with a natural vibrato and an ability to connect emotionally with lyrics that could not be taught. She just needed technical guidance to develop control and expand her capabilities. As Alina worked with Maya, adjusting her breathing and showing her how to access different parts of her range, she felt a sense of purpose and satisfaction that had been absent from her life for a long time. Teaching was giving as well as receiving, sharing knowledge while also learning from the unique qualities each student brought. It required her to be present and focused, to pay attention to details and respond to individual needs. The work pulled her outside herself in ways that felt healthy and necessary. The weeks leading up to the Thanksgiving service passed quickly, filled with practice and teaching, and the small routines of daily life that were gradually making Brookhaven feel like home. Alina established a few tentative friendships, meeting Patricia for coffee occasionally and chatting with other teachers when she came to the high school for lessons. She was still lonely much of the time, still grieving the life and the person she had lost. But the sharp edges of her grief were beginning to soften slightly, worn down by music and purpose and human connection. The night before the Thanksgiving service, Alina had trouble sleeping. She lay in bed running through the pieces she would sing, mentally rehearsing transitions and breathing points, worrying about all the things that could go wrong. This kind of performance anxiety was familiar from her professional career, but it felt more intense now because so much seemed to be riding on it. This was not just another gig, but a statement about who she was becoming in this new place. A test of whether she could sustain the momentum of that first impromptu performance at the talent showcase. When Thanksgiving morning arrived, Alina woke early and went through her pre-performance routine with careful attention. She did extensive vocal warm-ups, steamed her voice, and practiced breathing exercises to calm her nerves. She dressed carefully in a simple but elegant navy dress that felt appropriate for the church setting. Looking at herself in the mirror, she saw someone who looked more like the person she used to be, before grief had dulled her eyes and slumped her shoulders. The person looking back at her appeared capable and professional, someone who belonged on stage. The church was packed when Alina arrived an hour before the service. Patricia had not been exaggerating about the size of the crowd the Thanksgiving service attracted. The parking lot was full, and people were still streaming in from the street. Alina made her way to the small room behind the sanctuary where performers could wait and prepare, feeling her anxiety ratcheting up with each step. She had performed for much larger audiences during her professional career, in opera houses and concert halls across the country, but somehow this felt more intimidating because it mattered more personally. Patricia found her in the waiting room and immediately sensed her nervousness. She sat down beside Alina and took her hand, offering reassurance and perspective. She reminded Alina that the people gathered in the sanctuary were there to celebrate and give thanks, that they would receive whatever Alina offered with gratitude and appreciation. The performance was not about perfection, but about sharing something beautiful, about contributing to the collective experience of the service. Patricia's gentle wisdom helped Alina breathe more deeply and release some of the tension she had been holding. The service began with traditional hymns and readings, prayers and moments of reflection. Alina sat in the front pew, listening to the familiar rhythms of liturgy and letting them calm her racing thoughts. When the time came for her first piece, Patricia introduced her briefly to the congregation, mentioning that Alina was a professionally trained opera singer who had recently joined their community and had graciously agreed to share her gift with them. Alina walked to the front of the sanctuary and stood beside the piano where the church organist would accompany her. She looked out at the congregation and saw hundreds of faces, some familiar from the talent showcase or from around town, most of them strangers. She saw Maya sitting with her family, the girl's face alight with excitement and pride. She saw James from the high school and several other students from his classes. She saw people of all ages, from young children to elderly parishioners, all gathered together in this space of worship and community. She began with "I Know That My Redeemer Liveth," the Handel aria she had chosen first because its message of hope and redemption felt deeply personal. The opening phrases emerged from her with confidence and clarity, her voice filling the sanctuary with rich, full tone. She moved through the piece with careful attention to the text, bringing out the meaning of each phrase while also maintaining the flowing melodic line that made the music so beautiful. When she reached the climactic high notes, her voice soared with power and conviction, declaring the promise of resurrection and renewal that formed the heart of the piece. The congregation listened in rapt attention, many of them experiencing professional-level classical singing for the first time in their lives. Alina could feel their engagement, their openness to receiving what she was offering. It gave her confidence and allowed her to relax into the performance, to stop worrying about technical details and simply sing from her heart. Between pieces, as the service continued with more prayers and readings, Alina felt her nervousness dissolving. She was doing what she was meant to do, what she had trained for years to be able to do. The music was flowing through her naturally, the way it had in the best moments of her professional career. When it was time for her second piece, the arranged hymn, she sang with even more freedom and expression, allowing her voice to communicate the joy and gratitude embedded in the familiar melody. The final piece Alina performed was "There Is a Balm in Gilead," the spiritual that Patricia had suggested. This was the most emotionally challenging of the three selections because its themes of healing and comfort spoke directly to Alina's own experience of loss and grief. As she began to sing the opening lines about the balm that makes the wounded whole, she felt tears prickling at her eyes. She pushed through them, maintaining her vocal control while allowing the emotion to infuse every note. The spiritual built through its verses, each one adding layers of meaning about pain and healing, despair and hope. Alina sang with increasing intensity, not holding anything back, letting the congregation witness her vulnerability and her struggle and her tentative movement toward wholeness. By the final verse, tears were streaming down her face, but her voice remained strong and clear, carrying the message that even in our brokenness, healing was possible. When she finished, Alina stood motionless for a moment, overwhelmed by the emotions the performance had unleashed. The sanctuary was completely silent, the congregation processing what they had just experienced. Then, slowly, people began to applaud, and within moments the entire church was on its feet, giving Alina a standing ovation that rivaled the response at the talent showcase. But this time, the applause felt different, more reverent somehow, as if the sacred space and the spiritual content of the music had transformed the response into something closer to prayer than simple appreciation. The Thanksgiving service marked a turning point in Alina's integration into the Brookhaven community. In the weeks that followed, she found herself increasingly woven into the social fabric of the town. People who had been strangers became acquaintances and then friends. Invitations arrived for holiday gatherings, potluck dinners, and informal musical events. The isolation that had characterized her first months in Brookhaven gradually gave way to a sense of connection and belonging that surprised her with its depth and significance. Her teaching practice grew steadily as word spread about her abilities and her approach to working with students. She took on additional voice students, ranging from enthusiastic beginners to serious teenagers considering music careers. Each student brought unique challenges and rewards, requiring Alina to adapt her teaching methods and draw on different aspects of her knowledge and experience. The work was demanding but deeply satisfying, providing structure and purpose to her days while also generating enough income to make her financial situation more stable. Maya, her first student, was making remarkable progress under Alina's guidance. The girl's natural talent was blossoming with proper technique and focused practice. More importantly, Maya was discovering confidence and self-expression through music, becoming more willing to take risks and share her voice. Alina saw echoes of her younger self in Maya's journey, the way music could become a source of identity and strength for someone who might otherwise struggle to find their place in the world. Patricia invited Alina to join the church choir as a section leader, someone who could help train and support the other sopranos while also occasionally performing solo pieces during services. Alina accepted the invitation, finding that the regular commitment of Thursday evening rehearsals and Sunday morning services provided a rhythm and community she had not realized she was missing. The choir members welcomed her warmly, valuing her expertise while also appreciating her humility and willingness to be part of the group rather than setting herself apart. Through the choir, Alina met a diverse group of people who became important parts of her new life in Brookhaven. There was Margaret, a retired librarian with a passion for poetry and a surprisingly strong alto voice. There was Daniel, a young father who worked at the local bank and sang with unself-conscious joy. There was Grace, a nurse at the county hospital who used singing as a way to decompress from the emotional demands of her work. These people and others in the choir became Alina's friends, the core of a social network that made Brookhaven feel less like exile and more like home. As Christmas approached, Patricia asked Alina to organize and lead a special Christmas concert featuring the choir and several guest musicians from the community. The project would be Alina's largest undertaking since moving to Brookhaven, requiring her to step into a leadership role and coordinate multiple moving pieces. She felt intimidated by the responsibility but also energized by it. The concert would be an opportunity to give back to the community that had embraced her, to create something beautiful that would enhance the holiday season for everyone involved. Alina threw herself into planning the concert with characteristic thoroughness. She selected repertoire that would showcase the choir's strengths while also challenging them to grow. She recruited instrumentalists from the high school and the community to accompany certain pieces. She organized extra rehearsals and worked individually with choir members who were struggling with difficult passages. The work consumed her time and energy, but it also gave her a sense of purpose and accomplishment that had been missing from her life for far too long. During this busy period, Alina received an unexpected phone call from the regional opera company where she had performed several times during her professional career. The artistic director, a woman named Caroline who had always appreciated Alina's work, explained that they were mounting a production of La Bohème in the spring, and their original musetta had withdrawn from the production due to a family emergency. Caroline wondered if Alina might be interested in taking over the role. It would require relocating to the city for 6 weeks of rehearsals and performances, a significant commitment but also a substantial fee and the opportunity to return to professional opera at a high level. The offer caught Alina completely off guard. She had not considered the possibility of returning to her professional career, had assumed that chapter of her life was permanently closed. The role of Musetta was one she had performed before and knew well, a perfect showcase for her voice and her abilities as an actress. The production would be well-funded and professionally staged, exactly the kind of opportunity that singers competed fiercely to obtain. It was the sort of offer she would have accepted without hesitation in her previous life. Without hesitation in her previous life. But Alina was not the same person she had been before her husband's death and her move to Brookhaven. The life she was building here, with her students and her teaching and her place in the community, felt precious and fragile. She worried that leaving for 6 weeks might disrupt the connections she had been carefully nurturing, might undermine the sense of stability and belonging she had worked so hard to establish. She asked Caroline for time to think about it, promising to give her an answer within a week. Alina spent the next several days wrestling with the decision. She talked with Patricia, who encouraged her to pursue the opportunity if it felt right, but also assured her that the community would still be here when she returned. She talked with James from the high school, who told her that her students would benefit from seeing their teacher pursue professional opportunities, that it would model for them what a sustainable career in music could look like. She even talked with Maya, who was thrilled at the prospect of her teacher performing in a real opera production and begged to be able to attend one of the performances. What Alina could not do was talk with the one person whose opinion she most wanted to hear. Her husband had always been her sounding board for major decisions, the person who helped her think through options and supported whatever choice she ultimately made. His absence felt particularly acute as she faced this crossroads, this decision that would shape the direction of her new life. She found herself sitting in her apartment late at night, looking at old photographs of the two of them together and wondering what he would tell her to do. The answer, when it finally came to her, emerged not from external advice but from listening to her own heart. Alina realized that the question was not whether to accept the opera role, but whether she was ready to hold both parts of her life in balance, to be both the professional singer and the teacher and community member. She did not have to choose between Brookhaven and her career. She could do both, could move back and forth between different contexts and different aspects of her identity, allowing each to inform and enrich the other. Alina called Caroline and accepted the role of Musetta, with the understanding that she would need to return to Brookhaven frequently to maintain her teaching commitments, and that she would be back permanently once the production closed. Caroline agreed to the arrangement, understanding that Alina's life circumstances had changed and that flexibility would be necessary. They began discussing rehearsal schedules and logistics, and Alina felt a flutter of excitement mixed with nervousness about returning to the professional opera world after such a long absence. The Christmas concert took place 2 weeks before Alina was scheduled to leave for opera rehearsals. The church sanctuary was decorated beautifully, with evergreen boughs and candles creating an atmosphere of warmth and celebration. The concert had generated significant interest in the community, and the sanctuary was filled to capacity with people eager to experience the music Alina and the choir had been preparing. The program Alina had designed moved through different aspects of the Christmas story and season, from quiet contemplative pieces to joyful celebrations. The choir performed admirably, their voices blending with increasing confidence and musicality as the concert progressed. The instrumental accompaniment, provided by a small ensemble of local musicians, added richness and texture to the overall sound. Alina conducted with clear gestures and obvious passion, drawing out the best from everyone involved. Toward the end of the concert, Alina had programmed a solo piece for herself, a setting of "O Holy Night" that had always been one of her favorite Christmas songs. She stepped away from her conductor's position and moved to the front of the sanctuary, standing in the soft glow of candlelight as she prepared to sing. The accompanist began the gentle introduction, and then Alina's voice entered, pure and powerful, carrying the familiar melody with fresh emotional depth. As she sang the verses about a weary world rejoicing and souls feeling their worth, Alina thought about her own journey over the past year. She had arrived in Brookhaven broken and hopeless, convinced that the best parts of her life were behind her. But this community had welcomed her, had given her space to heal and opportunities to rebuild. Music had returned to her life not as a source of pressure or pain, but as a gift, a way of connecting with others and expressing truths too deep for words. She had found purpose in teaching, community in the choir, and the beginnings of hope that her future might hold beauty and meaning. The final verse of "O Holy Night" builds to a powerful climax, and Alina sang it with everything she had, her voice soaring to the high notes with confidence and joy. When she reached the final phrase, she held the last note with perfect control before letting it fade gradually into silence. The sanctuary remained quiet for a long moment after she finished, the audience held suspended in the beauty of what they had just experienced. Then the applause began, warm and sustained, a collective expression of gratitude and appreciation. After the concert ended, people lingered in the sanctuary, reluctant to leave the warmth and fellowship of the gathering. Alina found herself surrounded by well-wishers, many of them thanking her not just for the concert, but for everything she had brought to Brookhaven. Margaret from the choir hugged her tightly and whispered that Alina had become the daughter she had never had. Maya gave her a card that the high school students had signed, filled with messages of appreciation and encouragement. Patricia simply squeezed her hand and smiled, the gesture communicating more than words. This response paused because Claude reached its max length for a message. Hit continue to nudge Claude along. Continue. In the weeks between the Christmas concert and her departure for opera rehearsals, Alina worked intensively with her voice students to ensure they would be able to continue progressing during her absence. She recorded video lessons covering specific techniques and concepts they could reference while she was gone. She arranged for another teacher in the area to provide backup support if any students needed urgent help. She was determined that her professional opportunity would not come at the expense of her commitments to the young singers who depended on her. When the time came to leave for the city and the opera production, Alina felt a surprising pang of homesickness for Brookhaven even before she had departed. This small coastal town had become home in ways she had not anticipated, and leaving it, even temporarily, felt difficult. But she was also excited about the challenge ahead, about testing herself against the demands of professional opera after such a long absence from that world. She would be different in rehearsals than she had been in her previous career, shaped by loss and healing, and she was curious to discover how those changes would affect her work. The rehearsal process for La Bohème was intense and demanding, exactly as Alina remembered professional opera production to be. The director had a clear vision for the staging and required precision in both vocal and dramatic performance. Alina's castmates were all accomplished singers, and the level of musicianship was high. For the first few days, Alina felt rusty and uncertain, her technique not quite as solid as it had been before her hiatus from performing. But gradually, as she worked through the role and found her confidence, the skills and instincts of her professional training reasserted themselves. The role of Musetta allowed Alina to explore aspects of her artistry that teaching and church performances had not required. Musetta is a complex character, superficially flirtatious and attention-seeking, but ultimately capable of genuine love and sacrifice. Alina brought emotional depth to the role, finding layers of vulnerability beneath Musetta's confident exterior. Her famous aria, Quando me vo, became a showstopper, her voice filling the rehearsal hall with the kind of powerful, sensuous sound that made everyone stop and listen. During the rehearsal period, Alina traveled back to Brookhaven every other weekend to check in with her students and maintain her connections there. The trips were exhausting, requiring hours of driving after full days of rehearsal, but they were also essential for her sense of balance and grounding. Teaching Maya and her other students reminded Alina why music mattered beyond the professional accolades and the polished performances. It mattered because it gave people tools for self-expression and connection, because it helped them discover and develop parts of themselves that might otherwise remain dormant. The opening night of La Bohème arrived with all the excitement and nervous energy that professional opera performances generate. Alina stood backstage in her costume and makeup, transformed into Musetta visually, while also preparing to transform into her emotionally and vocally. She could hear the orchestra warming up in the pit and the murmur of the audience filling the opera house. These sensations were achingly familiar from her previous career, but they also felt new, experienced through the lens of everything that had changed in her life. When Alina made her entrance in Act 2, striding onto the stage in Musetta's attention-grabbing costume and immediately commanding focus, she felt a surge of pure joy. This was what she had trained for, what her voice was designed to do. She moved through the scene with confidence and charisma, playing Musetta's flirtation and vanity while also hinting at the deeper emotions beneath the surface. When the moment came for her aria, she positioned herself center stage and began to sing, her voice spinning out the seductive melody with perfect control and captivating beauty. The aria was a triumph, bringing the performance to a temporary halt as the audience erupted into applause before the opera could continue. Alina acknowledged the response briefly before the action resumed, but inside she was floating, exhilarated by the validation and the sheer pleasure of performing at this level. The rest of the opera unfolded beautifully, and when the final curtain fell, the applause was thunderous. Alina took her bows alongside her castmates, accepting the audience's appreciation with gratitude and a sense of completion. Among the audience members that night were several people from Brookhaven who had made the drive to the city to support Alina. Maya was there with her parents, the girl's face glowing with pride and excitement at seeing her teacher perform in a professional production. Patricia and Margaret had come together, along with several other choir members. Even James from the high school had driven up for the performance. After the show, they all gathered backstage to congratulate Alina, their presence a reminder that she was not just a performer but someone who belonged to a community that valued and supported her. The production ran for 3 weeks, with performances on Friday and Saturday nights and Sunday matinees. Each show was slightly different, shaped by the energy of the specific audience and the subtle variations that occur in live performance. Alina grew more comfortable in the role with each performance, finding new nuances and deepening her interpretation. The reviews praised her work, noting that she brought unusual emotional depth to a role that was often played in a more superficial manner. One critic wrote that Alina's Musetta seemed to understand loss and longing in ways that made her character's arc more poignant and believable. When the final performance concluded, and Alina took her last bows in the role, she felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and relief. The production had been artistically successful and personally validating, proving to herself and others that she could still perform at a professional level. But she was also ready to return to Brookhaven, to the life and the community she had been building there. The 6 weeks away had clarified for her that while professional performance would always be part of her identity, it was no longer the only or even the primary way she wanted to engage with music. Alina returned to Brookhaven in early spring, arriving as the coastal town was beginning to shake off winter and show signs of renewal. The cherry trees along Main Street were starting to bloom, and the air carried the fresh smell of ocean and new growth. Driving through the familiar streets toward her apartment, Alina felt a sense of homecoming that had nothing to do with the physical space, and everything to do with the relationships and commitments waiting for her there. Her students welcomed her back with enthusiasm and relief, eager to share what they had been working on and to resume their regular lessons. Maya had made significant progress during Alina's absence, developing her upper range and gaining confidence in her performance abilities. The other students had also grown, and Alina felt proud of their dedication and progress. She settled back into her teaching routine with satisfaction, appreciating anew the rewards of this work. The church choir had maintained their rehearsals during her absence, but they were delighted to have Alina back as their section leader and occasional soloist. Patricia told her that the choir had missed not just her musical leadership but her presence and her spirit, the way she brought both excellence and warmth to everything she did. Alina resumed her Thursday evening rehearsals and Sunday morning services, finding comfort in the familiar rhythms and the community of singers who had become her friends. As spring progressed into summer, Alina found herself fully integrated into Brookhaven life in ways that felt natural and sustainable. She taught voice lessons, sang with the choir, occasionally performed at community events, and gradually built friendships that extended beyond music into other areas of life. She joined a book club that Margaret had invited her to, started volunteering at the local food bank, and even adopted a cat from the animal shelter after realizing that her apartment felt too empty when she came home at night. The anniversary of her husband's death arrived in June, a date Alina had been dreading as it approached. She took the day off from teaching and drove to a quiet spot along the coast where she could sit and remember and grieve. She thought about the life they had shared, the love that had defined her adult existence, the crushing loss that had nearly destroyed her. She cried for him and for herself, for everything that had been taken and everything that could never be recovered. But she also recognized, sitting there looking out at the ocean, that she had survived. More than survived, she had found a way to build a new life that honored both her grief and her continued existence. She had not betrayed her husband's memory by learning to live without him. She had honored him by refusing to let loss be the final word, by finding ways to create beauty and meaning and connection even in the aftermath of devastation. The music that had once been silenced by grief had returned, and with it had come purpose and community and the possibility of joy. Alina stayed at the coast until sunset, watching the light change across the water and thinking about the year that had passed since she had moved to Brookhaven. She thought about the night at the talent showcase when she had been invited on stage, terrified and unprepared, and had discovered that her voice was still there waiting to be reclaimed. That single performance had set in motion everything that followed, opening doors she had not known existed and creating possibilities she could not have imagined in the depths of her grief. As she drove back to Brookhaven in the gathering darkness, Alina felt a sense of peace that had been absent from her life for a very long time. She was not the same person she had been before her husband's death, and she would carry that loss with her always. But she was also no longer defined solely by loss. She was a teacher and a performer, a friend and a community member, someone who contributed and connected and continued to grow. The stranger who had been invited to the stage for fun had stunned the entire hall. But more importantly, she had stunned herself, discovering that even in brokenness, transformation was possible, and that music, community, and courage could light the way forward into an uncertain but hopeful future. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. Double-check responses.